Petersburg in those days felt like an old pair of lungs struggling to breathe through the heavy summer air. Its damp alleyways, cracked walls, and creaking wooden staircases carrying the weight of thousands of forgotten lives. In a cramped attic room, a young man named Raskolnikov walked with the quiet heaviness of someone who had begun to fear his own footsteps, as if every step touched a stone carved by fate. He wasn't poor in the simple sense of lacking money. He was poor in the way a soul becomes poor, lacking hope, lacking warmth, lacking even a place in this world that could still hold him gently. Though it was summer, his room felt cold, because every letter from his mother tightened something deep in his chest. Her words were full of love, full of the kind of faith only a mother carries. Yet those very words pressed on him like invisible chains, reminding him of everything he wished he could be, but could no longer see in himself. His sister Dunya, brave but hurting, was ready to sacrifice her future and marry a man she did not love, all so their family could survive one more difficult season. Those sacrifices cut into him more deeply than hunger ever could, more painfully than the loneliness he tried so hard to hide. At night he sat alone, while the city around him seemed to hold its breath, watching him drift further into a gray fog where dreams melted like smoke. He had once wanted to be a good man, someone capable of changing the world for the better. But poverty strips more than comfort. It strips dignity, clarity, and the simple belief that tomorrow might still open its door gently. And when a person is pushed far enough into despair, they begin to hear thoughts they never imagined they could entertain, quiet whispers rising like a second shadow behind them, thoughts that say, if life cannot be changed by honest hands, then perhaps it must be changed by darker ones. That was the moment Raskolnikov stepped into the shadows, not because he chose the darkness, but because the light behind him was fading one fragile inch at a time. And when people no longer see a path back home, they walk forward, even if the road ahead is nothing but a cliff hidden by night. His story began on a night just like that, a night so ordinary no one would believe it could twist the course of a life forever. But it is often the quietest nights that destiny chooses to whisper its loudest truths. If you want to continue walking beside this journey of shadows, humanity, and the thin thread of hope that still survives, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And you, my friend, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below so we can feel a little closer as we walk this path together. There are theories meant to stay on paper, and there are theories that become dangerous the moment they fall into the hands of someone whose soul is already cracking. For Raskolnikov, the idea of the extraordinary man was not just a piece of philosophy, but a mask he used to hide the shame and helplessness of his poverty. Back when he was still a student, he wrote an essay that stunned his professor, claiming that humanity could be divided into two groups. The first were ordinary people, living quietly, obeying the law, accepting the limits society placed on them. The second were the rare, extraordinary individuals, people who, he argued, could cross moral boundaries if their goals were noble enough, even if it meant sacrificing a few insignificant lives for a supposedly greater purpose. At the time, that theory was just a bold intellectual exercise, a youthful fantasy born from the desire to feel different in a world that ignored him. But when life pushed Raskolnikov into darkness, when hunger hollowed his stomach and loneliness hollowed his heart, that theory transformed into the only thing he felt he had left to hold on to. In the dim glow of his oil lamp, his gaunt face revealed the cracks forming inside him. He wondered why someone intelligent and kind-hearted like himself had to be crushed by life, while greedy and cruel people seemed to thrive so easily out there. Those questions began as frustration, but slowly turned into justification for a growing idea. If the world was truly this unfair, then maybe wanting to change it wasn't wrong. Maybe, just maybe, he belonged to that special group the theory described, the kind of men allowed to do what ordinary people could not. What chills the reader is not the theory itself, but how quietly it seeps into him like a whisper anyone in deep despair might hear. At times it feels as though he clings to the theory not because he believes it is true, but because it is the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the weight of feeling useless to the very family he loves. And there is something painfully human in that, because when people desperately search for a reason to believe they still matter, they often grab onto the very thing that pulls them farthest from the light. In this part of the book, we don't just see an intelligent young man. We see someone drowning in hopelessness, reaching for anything that might keep him standing. And it is that hopelessness that turns a theory into a weapon and turns a once gentle soul into someone guided by the darkness of his own thoughts. There are moments in life when a person does not really change. They simply reveal the part of themselves that has been buried for too long, pressed down until it finally forces its way to the surface. For Raskolnikov, that moment began with an ugly wooden door, the one leading to the old pawnbroker's cramped room. Yet it was not the woman behind it that haunted him, but the sound of a knock he kept hearing inside his mind, a knock not made by his hand, but by the desperation swelling in his chest. People often believe a crime starts with a clear intention, but in truth, it starts much earlier, with a feeling of losing control when someone begins to believe they have no choices left. That was exactly where Raskolnikov stood. He did not wake up one morning and decide to do something terrible. No, he slid into it slowly, step by step, the way a person standing on a slippery hill only needs to lean slightly before the ground pulls them down. During those days, he wandered the humid streets of Petersburg, the heat pressing on him like an invisible weight, his mind foggy from hunger and exhaustion. But the worst part was not the heat or the hunger. It was the feeling that every door in life had already closed on him. Every time he thought of his mother, of Dunya, guilt cut into him like a blade. How could someone once praised for intelligence become so powerless, so useless in the face of his family's suffering? That shame clung to him like a shadow, whispering that unless he made one bold move, he would forever be the failure he saw in the mirror. And that was when the idea of the extraordinary man returned, not as philosophy, but as a sweet excuse for the pain he lived with. It told him he was not weak, only waiting for the moment to step beyond the limits that ordinary people feared. It told him that if his purpose was to save his family, then one ruthless act could be considered courage, even sacrifice. It sounded noble, almost heroic. But in truth, it was darkness disguised as strength, a temptation that speaks most clearly to those who are already exhausted. And so, the old door became a symbol. Every time he passed it, he felt it in his entire body, not just in his eyes. Sometimes he stood there for a long time, sweat soaking the back of his shirt, his hand trembling not from fear alone, but from the strange pull of inevitability. One evening he raised his hand and knocked, just once. The sound was soft, barely a tap, but inside his mind it roared like destiny pounding on his heart. Why was that knock so important? Because it was the moment he crossed the first boundary, the line between imagining and acting. From then on, whether he wanted it or not, he was no longer the same man. He tried to run from it, tried to forget it, but the more he tried, the louder the knock echoed in his thoughts, reminding him that once a person touches a forbidden door, they never return unchanged. What chills the reader is how the darkness did not charge at him like a wild beast, but arrived gently, quietly, almost kindly, allowing him to believe it was the only escape he had left. And because he believed it was his escape, he stepped forward. That is the tragedy. His path toward crime did not begin with hatred, but with love, with responsibility, with the desperate desire to save the people who meant everything to him. And that is why the journey feels so frightening and heartbreaking at the same time. As that door opened wider in his imagination, what waited behind it was not light, but a darkness spreading its arms, ready to welcome a soul that had been lost long before he ever lifted his hand to knock. There are moments in a person's life when just two movements, two simple blows, are enough to shatter an entire soul. For Raskolnikov, those two strikes of the axe were the exact moment, the final boundary between the man he once was and the darkness inside him broke apart. On that day, when he stepped into the pawnbroker's cramped little room, everything was so silent he could hear his own breathing echo against the walls. The whole city seemed to freeze while he stood there, his hand trembling slightly, yet his eyes strangely firm in a way even he could not understand. The first swing of the axe did not feel like an act of violence. It felt like the twisted answer to a question he had been asking himself for months. It did not strike him as metal hitting flesh, but as the sound of something deep inside him finally cracking. In that instant, he did not see blood or fear. He only felt an awful emptiness swallowing the room, as if time itself had been pulled out of the air. But then the door opened, and standing there was Lizaveta, gentle, innocent, someone he never meant to harm. Her wide, terrified eyes made him feel so small, so exposed, as if one blink could make him disappear. And then the second blow came down, not because he was cruel, not because he wanted to, but because fear had taken control of his hands. In that moment, he was like a drowning man, thrashing in dark water, striking out not to kill, but to survive the terror flooding his mind. It was that second blow that destroyed him. The first death he could still hide behind theory, behind desperation, behind the story he told himself. But Lizaveta's death carried no justification. It was pure panic, pure chaos, a moment that stripped away every illusion he had about being extraordinary. What chills the reader is not the blood, but the silence afterward. The room grew heavy, thick with the metallic smell of blood mixed with damp air. His breath caught in his throat. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. But inside that tiny room, something irreversible had happened. His heart pounded so violently, it felt like it was trying to escape his chest. He knew, with terrible clarity, that he had crossed a line no one could ever return from. As he grabbed a few worthless items, his hands shook uncontrollably, not with triumph, but with the horror of someone who no longer recognized himself. Everything felt unreal, dreamlike, as if he were walking through a nightmare where nothing made sense and nothing had meaning. Raskolnikov fled that house like a man running away from his own shadow. Outside, people laughed, chattered, lived freely. But for him, the world had dimmed, as if a veil had dropped over his eyes. The deed did not make him stronger, did not make him extraordinary. It only showed him that some doors, once opened with blood, close behind you forever, locking you inside a life you never intended to choose. And in that moment, he understood something devastating, something he could no longer deny. The real darkness was never in that room. It was inside him, spreading quietly, tearing his heart apart piece by piece. There are truths a person can hide with words, with logic, with carefully crafted explanations. But there is one thing that refuses to lie no matter how desperately we want it to, and that is the human body. After those two violent blows, when Raskolnikov stepped out of the pawnbroker's house, believing he had crossed the line cleanly, it was not the law, nor the neighbors, nor even God who confronted him first. It was his own flesh and blood. He walked down the steps trying to control his breath, trying to imitate the confident posture of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But every muscle in his body shook, as if rejecting the story his mind was trying to script. His heart didn't pound with fear of being arrested. It pounded because it refused the identity he was forcing onto it. And that is what makes this part of the story so painfully human. His body recognized the crime long before he could mentally admit it. When he finally reached his room, he didn't sit, didn't think, didn't plan what to do next. He simply collapsed onto his bed like a man whose bones had turned to dust. The walls around him felt closer than before, as if the air itself wanted to press him flat. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. Sweat drenched his shirt, yet his hands were freezing cold. His body burned with fever, but his feet felt like ice. He wasn't sick. He was unraveling. The nerves in his stomach tightened until he vomited repeatedly, unable to control it, as if his body was trying to purge the act his mind refused to name. And the strangest part is that the world outside didn't change at all. Petersburg still breathed with its usual noise. Carriages rolling over cobblestones, drunk men shouting in alleys, children running barefoot across courtyards. Life, indifferent and loud, continued forward. But inside Raskolnikov's room, every sound became sharp, distorted, accusatory. Whenever he heard footsteps in the hallway, his body seized in panic. Not because he thought the police had come, but because something deep in him feared exposure, feared being seen in this raw, broken state. The days that followed became a torment he hadn't expected. The theory he once believed would keep him steady now crumbled at the slightest touch. He walked through the streets like a ghost, feverish, dizzy, sweating, then shivering. His thoughts jumped uncontrollably, like shattered mirrors reflecting random fragments. At times he muttered nonsense under his breath, At times, he fell silent mid-sentence, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Razumikin, loyal and warm-hearted, tried to help, placing a hand on his shoulder and asking softly if he was all right. Yet that gentle touch felt to Raskolnikov like someone pressing directly on a bruise the world was not meant to see. His body tightened instantly. His voice cracked. His eyes drifted away, refusing to meet anyone else's gaze. What makes this part unforgettable is how clearly we see that the real battle isn't with the law. It is inside his skin. His body becomes the detective he can't outrun. Every tremor is an interrogation. Every fever is an accusation. Every faltering breath is a confession he didn't mean to give. And the deeper he tries to bury what he's done, the louder his body speaks. His hands shake when he tries to eat. His legs weaken at the sight of strangers. His stomach knots if someone mentions the murder in passing. Even his sleep betrays him, pulling him into dreams where he hears footsteps, whispers, the dull echo of the acts he can never forget. In this spiral, one truth becomes painfully clear. Crime does not simply stain the conscience, it stains the flesh. The body remembers even when the mind insists it has moved on. And, for Raskolnikov, this is the beginning of a punishment far worse than prison. His own heart beats against him. His own breath exposes him. His own body becomes a prison he cannot escape, reminding him with every shiver, every fever, every sleepless night, that there are sins so deep they echo from the inside, knocking again and again, long after the world has fallen silent. There are people who enter our lives so quietly that we do not realize they are the last warm hands trying to pull us back before we fall into the dark. For Raskolnikov, these people appeared not to judge him, not to interrogate him, but simply to stand near him with a kind of gentle loyalty he no longer believed he deserved. Marmeladov was the first, a broken drunk, wrecked by life, ashamed of himself, yet in that small, trembling moment, when he sat beside Raskolnikov in the tavern, he reminded him of something the young man had forgotten. Even when people fall to the lowest point, they still long to love and be loved. His story about Sonia, the daughter who had to sell her own dignity to feed her family, struck Raskolnikov with a strange, painful tenderness, as if someone had pressed a finger onto the very wound he tried to hide. Marmeladov was weak, lost, often pathetic, but in his shaking voice there was a spark of hope, a fragile belief that life could still forgive those who were suffering. Then there was Razumikin, the kind of friend who seems too good to be real, the kind readers want to reach into the page just to thank on Raskolnikov's behalf. Razumikin did not understand what was happening, did not know why his friend was acting so strangely, why he looked pale, startled, and hollow, as if he were wandering through someone else's nightmare. But Razumikin stayed. He brought food, brought comfort, brought warmth. He placed a steady hand on Raskolnikov's shoulder and spoke with a sincerity only a truly good person could have. He did not know that the moment his hand touched that shoulder, Raskolnikov had to fight the urge to flinch as his body tightened like a wound being pressed. He did not know that every time he asked, "Are you all right?" it felt to Raskolnikov like a small knife tapping on the secret he was trying to bury. Yet Razumikin never walked away. He stayed not because he knew the truth, but because he sensed the pain hidden beneath Raskolnikov's silence, a pain visible in the way the young man lowered his eyes and avoided every gaze. And then came his mother, the woman who poured her entire soul into every letter she wrote. She had no idea her son had stepped off the edge of goodness. She did not know the storm of guilt crushing him. She only knew how to love him, to believe in him, to send him faith even when she barely had any left for herself. But that love, pure and unconditional, was agony for Raskolnikov. When she arrived in Petersburg and wrapped her arms around him with pride and hope, he could not look her in the eyes, terrified that 1 second of eye contact would reveal everything he was hiding. And finally, there was Sonia, the gentlest soul in the entire novel, a girl with no pride left to protect, no judgment left to give, someone who simply listened with a heart soft enough to suffer on behalf of others. Sonia, who had been pushed to the very edge of life herself, still had enough compassion to open her heart to a man who looked like he was slowly dying inside. She did not know the full truth, but she could feel a tremor in his voice, the heaviness in his breath, the burden he carried, as if the sky itself had fallen on his shoulders. What makes this part of the story unforgettable is exactly this. The people trying to save him had no idea what he had done. They loved him without knowing the darkness he carried. They helped him without understanding what they were touching. They reached for him with kindness, not knowing their hands were brushing against the edge of a terrible truth. And that unknowing kindness is what hurt him most. Because sometimes it is not the darkness that drags a person deeper, but the light shining from those who still care, even when we know we no longer deserve it. Sonia enters Raskolnikov's life not with noise, not with force, but with a softness so quiet that at first he almost overlooks her, as if the world itself tried to hide its last remaining light behind the most fragile person it could find. She is small, timid, dressed in clothes that do not fit, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who has lived too many sorrows for her age. Yet when she looks at someone, truly looks, it feels as if she sees the part of them they no longer dare to see themselves. Sonia is the kind of girl the world crushes without hesitation. Poverty pushed her into choices that would break most people. She works not out of desire, but out of a desperation born from love, from the need to keep her family alive. Every night she walks the streets with trembling steps, and every morning she returns home with a heart that refuses to harden, no matter how much life tries to turn it to stone. When Raskolnikov first meets her, he does not fully understand why her presence unsettles him. Maybe it is because she mirrors something inside him, a raw truth he is afraid to face. She carries shame, yes, but she wears it with a dignity that shouldn't be possible. Her hands shake, but her voice stays gentle. Her eyes well with tears, but her soul refuses to collapse. In a world full of people who shout, Sonia's quiet becomes a kind of miracle. And it is this quiet strength that pulls Raskolnikov toward her, like a man reaching for air after nearly drowning. When he visits her small, dimly lit room, something shifts inside him. He sees her Bible, touched so often the pages have softened. He sees her siblings clinging to her, trusting her without question. And in her presence, for the first time since the murder, his heartbeat changes. It steadies, not because he feels safe, but because he feels seen. Sonia does not know what he has done, not yet, but she senses a darkness hovering around him, something heavy and trembling beneath his words, and instead of turning away from it, she steps closer, not with boldness, but with compassion, so instinctive it feels sacred. When he finally tells her the truth, the terrible truth, she does not scream, does not recoil, does not condemn him. Her breath trembles, tears gather, but her eyes remain open, steady, full of a kind of pain that comes from caring too deeply. She listens as if listening is an act of mercy. Her hands shake, yet she does not pull them away. And when he finishes, when the room falls into that unbearable silence, she whispers something that feels less like forgiveness and more like a promise that he is not beyond redemption. Sonia becomes his anchor, not by lecturing him or justifying him, but simply by staying. She stands beside him when he is at his darkest, as if she has spent her entire life learning how to comfort the broken. She reads to him from her Bible, her voice soft but unwavering, telling him stories of suffering and resurrection, not to absolve him, but to remind him that even the most shattered soul can rise again. What makes Sonia extraordinary is not her purity or her suffering. It is her courage to love in a world that has given her every reason to stop. She becomes the light he did not know he needed, the one person who reaches into the darkness without flinching, who sees the wounded child behind the crime, and dares to believe that somewhere beneath it all, goodness still breathes. Sonia is not a hero in the way stories usually define heroes. She does not fight. She does not conquer. She does not shout. She saves people simply by refusing to abandon them. And for Raskolnikov, whose heart has become a battlefield of guilt and fear, she is the first gentle thing he has touched in a long, long time. A hand held out in the dark, a lantern that refuses to go out, a small, quiet reminder that even in the darkest corners of the human soul, light can still find a way to live. Porfiri Petrovitch enters the story not like a typical detective, not with loud boots or sharp commands, but with an unsettling gentleness, the kind that makes you realize the most dangerous hunters are the ones who never need to run. He is small, slightly overweight, with eyes that look tired but never unfocused, and a smile that feels warm until you realize it is the way he studies you, while smiling that makes your heartbeat stumble. When he first meets Raskolnikov, he does not accuse, does not suspect out loud, does not even hint at the crime. Instead, he talks to him the way a father might talk to a troubled son, circling conversations slowly, letting silence settle in the room like dust, watching carefully to see how Raskolnikov moves when the quiet becomes too heavy. Porfiri believes something most detectives forget. A guilty man will reveal himself long before evidence reveals him. He listens for tremors in a voice, watches the stiffness of a hand, waits for the flicker of the eyes that comes when truth collides with fear. And Raskolnikov, already fragile from guilt and fever, begins to unravel faster than he realizes. Every visit to Porfiri feels like walking into a room where the walls lean just a little too close, where the sunlight seems just a little too bright, where time slows down enough for your own heartbeat to betray you. Porfiri has a talent for asking questions that sound harmless, but hit the exact nerve a criminal tries hardest to numb. He asks Raskolnikov about morality, about extraordinary men, about whether a great purpose could ever justify breaking the law. He frames the questions as philosophical curiosity, yet each one feels like a needle slipping quietly beneath the skin. When Raskolnikov tries to play it cool, Porfiry only tilts his head, smiles softly, and lets the silence answer for him. It is this silence that terrifies Raskolnikov most. Porfiry never interrupts, never rushes, never pushes. He simply lets the young man talk and talk and talk until the words begin to stumble over each other. There is a moment in one of their conversations when Porfiry leans forward just slightly, like someone listening to a confession he knows is coming, but is willing to wait for. And in that moment, the air shifts. Raskolnikov feels watched in a way he cannot explain, like Porfiry sees not just the man in front of him, but the shadow of the crime that still clings to him. Porfiry does not need evidence because he reads people the way others read books. He notices the way Raskolnikov avoids certain topics, the way he grows agitated when Lizaveta's name is mentioned, the way his voice trembles whenever the word justice comes up in conversation. It is not the trembling itself that matters, but the pattern, the rhythm of fear that Porfiry recognizes the way a musician recognizes a familiar melody. What makes Porfiry so unforgettable is that he never treats Raskolnikov as a villain. He treats him as a human being who has lost his way. And it is precisely that empathy that tightens the noose. He wants Raskolnikov to confess not for the sake of punishment, but for the sake of the young man's soul. He knows that guilt is slowly killing him from the inside, that no prison sentence could be worse than the feverish torment Raskolnikov is already living in. The detective becomes less of an adversary and more of a mirror, reflecting back the truth Raskolnikov tries to deny. There is a point when Porfiry quietly says that criminals often return to the scene of their crimes, not because they are foolish, but because they feel drawn to the place where their life split in two. And when he says this, he watches Raskolnikov's reaction without blinking. The young man's breath catches, his eyes twitch, and for a brief second, Porfiry sees everything he needs to see. Yet he does not arrest him. He lets him leave. That is the brilliance, the cruelty, and the compassion of Porfiry. He knows the only confession that matters is the one Raskolnikov chooses to give, so he waits, he watches, he gently closes every door except the one that leads to the truth, and in doing so, he becomes one of the most haunting detectives ever written, a man whose greatest weapon is understanding, whose pursuit is silent, whose victory is not an arrest, but a broken soul finally whispering what it has been trying so hard not to feel. Svidrigailov enters the story like a shadow slipping into a room where the windows are already shut, carrying with him the kind of silence that makes people instinctively step back. He is not loud, not reckless, not obviously dangerous, yet there is something unsettling in the way he smiles, something cold in the way his eyes seem to drift past the surface of a person and settle into the part of them they would rather keep hidden. While Raskolnikov is drowning in guilt, fever, and moral confusion, Svidrigailov moves through life with an ease that feels unnatural, as if he has mastered the art of ignoring the weight that crushes other men. He has done terrible things, everyone knows it, even he knows it, but he speaks about them with a casual shrug, like someone discussing weather that has already passed. What makes him frightening is not the evil he has done, but the absolute calm he carries afterward. A calm that suggests he long ago decided guilt was a luxury he chose not to afford. When he begins to take an interest in Raskolnikov, it feels less like curiosity and more like recognition, as if he sees in the young man the same fracture he once saw in himself. Their conversations are unnerving because Svidrigailov listens too carefully, speaks too gently, and reacts too softly to things that should shock any ordinary soul. He circles Raskolnikov with the quiet confidence of someone who understands the dark better than the light, and Raskolnikov, already fragile, senses it. He senses that Svidrigailov is not a warning but a reflection, a mirror of what he could become if he continued down the path of denial. Svidrigailov talks about morality the way gamblers talk about luck. He treats consequences as inconveniences and suffering as something that happens only to people who have not learned to detach themselves. He is a man who has built an entire philosophy around the refusal to feel guilt, and in his presence, Raskolnikov sees the future he is terrified of becoming. The way Svidrigailov speaks of Dunya sends a chill through the reader, not because he threatens her openly, but because he desires her with the intensity of someone who believes anything he wants should belong to him. And yet, underneath all that coldness, there is something broken in him, something hollow, like a light that flickered once long ago and never returned. His final nights in Petersburg are haunting, wandering through the fog as if searching for a reason to keep living. He tries to talk to Raskolnikov in a way that sounds almost like compassion, almost like warning, as if saying, "I know this road, and there is nothing at the end of it except emptiness." But Raskolnikov, trapped in his own storm, cannot fully hear it. When Svidrigailov finally takes his own life, it is not a dramatic act, but a quiet, tired surrender from a man who has run out of places to hide from himself. It is in that moment the contrast between the two men becomes painfully clear. Raskolnikov suffers because he still has a conscience, still has pieces of humanity clawing inside him. Svidrigailov suffers because he lost his long ago. And this is what makes Book 9 so powerful. Svidrigailov is not just a character. He is a warning, a living ghost, showing what happens when a person chooses numbness over truth. Through him, we see the future Raskolnikov fears most, the future he might still escape if he can learn what Svidrigailov never could. That guilt, painful as it is, might be the last thread connecting a man to what makes him human. Raskolnikov's confession does not begin the moment he speaks the truth. It begins long before that, in the quiet collapse of his spirit, in the way his breath shortens whenever Sonia looks at him with those soft, searching eyes. He does not tell her what he has done at first, but his body has already started whispering it. His hands shake, his eyes dart away, his voice trembles at the edges. And Sonia, fragile yet impossibly strong, senses the storm inside him with the instinct of someone who has lived her whole life listening for pain. On the night he finally goes to her room, something inside him breaks open. He sits across from her in the dim glow of a single candle, its small flame flickering like a heartbeat that cannot keep steady. The room is silent, but the silence feels heavy, alive, filled with everything he has been trying to hold back. Sonia watches him without judgment. her fingers clutching the worn Bible that has been her anchor through every cruelty life placed upon her. Raskolnikov begins to speak in fragments, not in confessions, but in fear, in confusion, in the exhaustion of a man who has run too far from himself. He tells her about the darkness that followed him, about the weight crushing his chest, about his belief that some people were allowed to cross lines, others could not. Sonia listens, her tears gathering not from horror but from heartbreak, because she sees a man suffering, not a monster. And when the truth finally slips from his lips, it comes out not as a declaration, but as a surrender, soft and trembling, like something he has been forced to carry far longer than a human heart should. He expects Sonia to recoil, to scream, to push him away. But instead, she steps closer. Her hands shake, yet she does not let them fall. Her voice is barely above a whisper when she tells him that love does not disappear in the presence of sin, that some souls break not because they are evil, but because they are human. She reads to him the story of Lazarus, her voice steady, even though her tears fall freely. Each word feels like a promise, like an invitation to rise, to breathe again, to let the truth set him free. Raskolnikov says nothing, but his silence is louder than any confession. His shoulders slump, his eyes lower, his defenses collapse. And in that moment, sitting on the edge of her small bed, with the weight of his crime finally spoken aloud, he looks less like a murderer and more like a boy who has wandered too far into the dark and no longer knows how to return. Sonia does not forgive him with words. She forgives him simply by staying, by placing her trembling hand over his, by letting him know that confession is not the end, but the beginning of a different kind of story. And in that quiet room, without a single dramatic gesture, Raskolnikov gives the truest confession he has ever given, a confession without pride, without excuses, without words. The day Raskolnikov decided to walk to the police station was not marked by thunder or drama or any great force of nature. It was a quiet day, almost painfully ordinary, the kind of day where the world moves on without noticing the war raging inside one man. He stepped out into the street with heavy breaths, not because he was afraid of being arrested, but because, for the first time in months, he was not running. The world around him continued with its usual rhythm. Vendors shouting, carts rolling by, children weaving through the crowds. Yet to Raskolnikov everything felt muted, distant, as if he were watching life through a pane of glass that had slowly thickened with every sleepless night. His body moved forward, but his mind was caught between two worlds, the one he had shattered with his crime, and the one Sonia had shown him, a world where truth, even painful truth, might still hold a doorway back to being human. She had walked beside him until the last corner, her steps small but unwavering, her hands trembling yet determined. When he turned to look at her one last time, her face held nothing but love and sorrow, the kind of sorrow that comes from knowing you cannot carry someone's burden for them. Her presence gave him strength and broke him at the same time. For a moment he wanted to run back, to disappear into the fog of the city, to cling to the last illusion that he could outwalk his guilt. But then he saw the truth in her eyes. Running had already taken everything from him. At the door of the police station, Raskolnikov paused. The world around him felt strangely still, as if time itself were holding its breath. The noise of the city faded. All he could hear was the soft echo of Sonia's voice from the night before, telling him that confession is not the end, but the beginning of becoming whole again. His hand hovered in the air before finally pushing the door open. Inside, the station smelled of ink, sweat, and the routine burdens of everyday crime, a place where life's tragedies were sorted into files and written into ledgers. To the officers present, he was just another young man entering with a troubled expression. But to Raskolnikov, each step across that floor felt like stepping across the edge of his own fear. When he finally spoke, the words did not come out strong. They came out thin, fragile, almost broken. He whispered that he had something to confess. The officers turned slowly, expecting a minor theft or a drunken fight, but the look on his face made them straighten, and in that quiet, heavy moment, without theatrics, without tears, Raskolnikov released the weight he had been carrying alone. It was not a heroic act. It was not dramatic. It was simply the truth finding its way out. Outside, Sonia waited in the street, watching the doorway, hands clasped tightly to stop them from shaking. She did not know what was happening inside, but she knew the world had shifted. For her, the sun felt different. For him, time felt different. And in that single moment, when Raskolnikov surrendered to the truth, the world, which had been spinning endlessly around him, finally stopped, not to punish him, but to let him breathe. Siberia does not greet Raskolnikov with fury. It greets him with silence, the kind of silence that feels colder than the snow beneath his feet, the kind that seeps into a man's bones and forces him to face every part of himself he once tried to outrun. The prison camp is a world stripped down to survival, a place where men sleep lightly and speak little, where time does not pass but stretches, long and bleak, like an endless winter night. Raskolnikov expected chains, punishment, humiliation, but what he finds is something far more unbearable: indifference. The other prisoners look at him with suspicion, even disdain. To them, he is not a tragic thinker or a misguided idealist. He is simply the man who killed a defenseless old woman and her innocent sister. They do not care about theories or the weight on his soul. They care about the simple truth of blood spilled. And so Raskolnikov lives among them like a ghost, unconnected, unclaimed, a man who eats, works, and sleeps on the edges of their world. At first he tells himself he feels nothing. He convinces himself that prison has not changed him, that the part of him that once believed in extraordinary men is still alive somewhere. But as the nights grow long and the cold grows sharper, this lie begins to crack. The weight of monotony, the sound of chains clinking in the dark, the sight of exhausted faces around him, all of it slowly strips away the pride he clung to like armor. Yet the deepest shift does not happen in the camp. It happens in a small wooden village nearby, where Sonia lives in a poor rented room, working tirelessly, visiting him whenever she can. She comes through storms, through sickness, through days when even hope feels too heavy to carry. She sits with him quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her smile soft and unwavering. She never forces him to speak. She never asks him to repent. She simply stays, her presence a warmth he pretends not to need, but feels aching in every part of him. For months he keeps his heart locked, refusing her kindness, telling himself that love, forgiveness, redemption are nothing but illusions. But then one day Sonia falls ill. And when Raskolnikov hears this, something inside him fractures. For the first time since his arrest, he feels fear not for himself, but for someone else. He feels the fragile truth that her presence has been the only thing keeping a small flame alive inside him. When she recovers and visits him again, he looks at her differently. Her thin face, her tired smile, her gentle eyes. In that moment, his soul stirs, not with pride, but with gratitude, with longing, with a pain that feels strangely like rebirth. One evening, as she sits beside him, his defenses finally collapse. Tears blur his vision as he kneels before her, not in worship, but in surrender, finally admitting through his shaking breath what he could never say with words, that he needs her light, that he wants to live, that somewhere beneath the rubble of his guilt, a new beginning waits. It is then, and only then, that dawn touches him. Not a dramatic sunrise, but a faint glimmer reflected in Sonia's eyes. A promise that even 8 years of night cannot extinguish the possibility of a new day. Raskolnikov's resurrection does not arrive like a miracle or a sudden burst of light. It comes slowly, quietly, the way spring melts the last layer of ice on a forgotten river. For months, even after Sonia's unwavering devotion begins to soften the edges of his heart, he remains a man half alive, moving through the Siberian camp with a heaviness that seems carved into his bones. But something in him has shifted, something small at first, like a heartbeat waking after a long winter's sleep. It begins the day he realizes he is no longer angry at the world. He watches the prisoners around him, men hardened by life, men who curse and fight and weep in silence. And for the first time, he sees them not as obstacles, but as reflections of his own suffering. He lifts a bucket for a man too weak to stand, offers a piece of bread to another who has nothing left. And though these gestures are tiny, they carve